Sandor Clegane stood at the edge of the desolate courtyard, his broad shoulders turned toward the hulking figure of his older brother. Blood trickled from his split lip, tasting of copper and ash on his tongue. The mountain loomed in the flickering torchlight, taller than any man present, garbed in dark steel still stained from a dozen battles. Gregor's eyes glowed with a fierce, cruel light as he shifted his greatsword in his gauntleted hands. For Sandor, all the fear that had clung to him since childhood felt suddenly dwarfed by a cold clarity. It would end here tonight, on the wind-swept grounds behind the broken walls of the Red Keep, under a bruised sky that threatened rain. The Watchers, soldiers, lords, opportunists and the desperate, had gathered around them in a fearful ring. Everyone wanted to witness the clash between the two monstrous warriors who had long been both dreaded and reviled. Yet no one could have guessed that the outcome of this singular duel would change the fate of the kingdom. The torches licked the broken stones with uncertain light, dancing shadows between the men. Sandor felt the dryness in his throat, the sweat on his palms. His sword was good steel, though smaller than Gregor's monstrous blade. It might as well have been a toy in comparison. And yet, Sandor no longer felt the old nightmares clawing at him. The memory of how Gregor had pressed his face into the fire that day when he was just a boy, those searing flames that had branded him forever, felt distant now, like something belonging to another man's life. In its place burned a steely resolve. He knew he had to kill his brother. He knew it was the only way to close that old wound. The Watchers were hushed, as though the entire courtyard itself had halted its breath. Not even the crows dared caw. Some remote corner of Sandor's mind thought how unnatural that silence was in a city always buzzing with life. But the streets behind them had been cleared by fear of the mountain, by the new wave of chaos that had stricken King's Landing in the aftermath of the last war. Bodies littered the side alleys, casualties of riots and lawlessness. For many, the realm had become a place where the only law was the steel you held in your hand. This duel for some was the last gasp of hope that some sort of order might be restored. For others, it was an apocalyptic sign that even the mightiest were devouring themselves. Regardless, all eyes were fixated on the two brothers, the shining reflection of torchlight on steel, the swirl of dust at their feet. Sandor inhaled. Gregor's thick helmet hid his face in shadow, leaving only two ferocious eyes that peered out like dark coals. Sandor could imagine the sadistic grin that might twist Gregor's scarred lips inside that metal. For just a heartbeat they stared at each other, brother to brother, foe to foe. Then Gregor struck. His greatsword swung in a savage arc so swift that any lesser man would have been hewn in half. But Sandor ducked and twisted, feeling the whoosh of air behind his neck as the blade passed inches from him. He let out a growl, part fury, part exhilaration, and pushed forward. Steel met steel in a crash that seemed to shatter the stillness. Sandor felt the shock vibrate up his arm, rattling his teeth in his skull, but he held firm. The sparks that danced from their clashing blades fell like twisted stars. Gregor pushed against him with a strength beyond ordinary men, forcing Sandor back a step. Sandor braced with every muscle in his broad frame. Pain seared along his shoulder, but it was pain that kept him awake, kept him present, and kept him from slipping into that old fear. This was not a boy cowering before a fire. This was a man standing against a monster. They broke apart, circling each other, boots grinding against the rubble of the courtyard. Gregor's breath came in rasping wheezes behind the helmet. Sandor's chest rose and fell with ragged effort, but he felt a hard steadiness within him, the heartbeat of a man who had lost everything but his need to survive. A single drop of sweat fell into his eye, stinging, but he ignored it. Gregor struck again, a downward slash that threatened to cleave Sandor from shoulder to waist. Sandor sidestepped and thrust, aiming for the gap in Gregor's armor at the armpit. The point landed, but not deeply, grazing the metal plating. Gregor let out a bestial snarl and swung the pommel of his sword toward Sandor's temple. Sandor ducked low just in time to avoid being knocked senseless, feeling the brush of wind against his ear. He saw his chance and slammed his free hand against Gregor's chest, trying to put distance between them. For a moment he caught a flash in Gregor's eyes, recognition perhaps, a cruel gleam of something that might have been respect. But the mountain was not a man who gave respect easily. The ring of onlookers pressed closer, despite themselves. The tension of the duel was like a magnet drawing them in, crowding the edges of that grim stage. Many wanted Gregor to win out of simple fear. Others hated him for the atrocities he had committed, raiding villages, torturing prisoners, all manner of cruelty that had left families broken and children orphaned. The Hound, for all his brutality, had shown glimpses of humanity in the past. That faint spark was enough for some to root for him. But no matter who they favored, no one could look away. Sandor spat blood, raised his sword, and charged. He feigned high, then twisted low, slashing toward Gregor's thigh. Gregor's parry came almost too late, the blade scraping and sending sparks flying. Sandor kept up the offensive, his strikes rapping again and again against Gregor's defenses, pressing him back step by step. His mind was focused to a razor's edge, aware only of the steel, the swirl of dust, and Gregor's dark eyes. Their panting breaths filled the night air, raw and ragged, a frantic drumbeat against the hush of the assembled throng. Gregor countered with a heavy blow that knocked Sandor off balance. Sandor staggered, one knee buckling against the rubble. In that moment, Gregor raised his sword overhead, poised for a killing strike. The watchers cried out as one, some in horror, some in perverse excitement. But Sandor rolled to the side at the last heartbeat, feeling the crash of steel into stone behind him as sparks shot up from the impact. He twisted, swept his sword upward, and felt the jarring force as the blade bit into Gregor's side, sliding between the plates of armor. A roar erupted from behind the helm, torn from deep in Gregor's chest. He stumbled, the edge of Sandor's sword coated in blood now. For the first time, Sandor sensed vulnerability. Sandor didn't let the moment slip away. He lunged again, ignoring the burning in his own limbs, ignoring the bruise swelling on his cheek. His blade found the gap in Gregor's gorget and sank him beneath the helm. The mountain let out a wet, choking gasp. A great hand lashed out, slamming into Sandor's side, sending him stumbling back. But the wound was mortal. Gregor's sword fell from his grip, clattering against the ground. He swayed, knees buckling. Sandor watched, sword still raised, as the hulking figure that had haunted his nightmares crashed face first onto the stones with an echoing clang. For a moment it was as if time had frozen. Then Sandor's chest exploded with breath, an exhalation of relief, triumph, and a bitter grief he had never anticipated. He stood over the body of his brother, his old tormentor, watching the blood seep out around the edges of the helmet. The watchers erupted into chaos, a cacophony of shouts, gasps, muttered prayers, curses. Someone rushed forward to see if the mountain truly was dead, but no man was fool enough to actually touch him. Sandor turned his gaze away, sheathing his sword with trembling hands. He had spent so many years harboring hatred for his brother, dreaming of this moment. Now that it was real, it felt hollow. There was no ecstasy, no sweet sense of cosmic justice. There was only the bitter satisfaction of seeing that monstrous figure broken on the stones. Then came the murmurs. Someone shouted that the king was dead, that Gregor had killed him in a final act of brutality just days before. Another cried out that the realm was leaderless, that chaos would reign if no one stepped forward. In the swirl of rumor, curses, and panic, someone else pointed at the Hound. The hush came again, as though the entire crowd had been struck dumb by that single outcry. Sandor felt their eyes on him, their fear, their desperation. The realization struck, with the king gone, with no heir strong enough to hold the throne, some were looking to him. The man who had just slain the mightiest warrior in the realm. The man who had bested the monster. The hush felt more claustrophobic than the fight itself. He turned to walk away, but a voice rang out, commanding him to stop. One of the lords, tall and gaunt, in an ornate doublet, stepped forward. Sandor remembered the man as a minor noble who had once flinched at the mere mention of Gregor's name. Now, this lord dropped to one knee in front of Sandor. His voice shook with either conviction or cunning. Sandor couldn't tell which. "We need a king," he said, "a king who has proven he can slay even the mountain." Others began to follow, bowing or kneeling. Sandor stared at them, his expression twisted between confusion, anger, and a choking sort of disbelief. He nearly barked at them to stand, to stop their nonsense, but more lords, knights, and soldiers joined in. Their voices mingled with the wind, half pleas, half commands. as though the entire city now pinned its trembling hopes on this battered, wounded man. He saw hunger in some faces, opportunistic cunning in others, raw devotion in a few. Those who had once deemed him nothing but a hound now saw in him the power to quell the tide of chaos. He realized in that moment that the realm was truly desperate. So desperate that it would anoint a man like him, if only to have someone to hold the fracturing pieces together. Sandor's mouth felt dry. He thought to walk away, but something in his gut stopped him. A part of him, buried deep, had once cared for something more than anger and survival. Some part that had tried to protect a vulnerable girl, that had once shown pity for the helpless. Perhaps that was the Ember these people saw. He glanced around and saw that men-at-arms, even a few from the city watch, were kneeling as well. The wind carried the stench of blood and soot, the city's night air thick with foreboding. There was no rightful heir left, or none that had the might to seize the throne without plunging everyone into more bloodshed. The old kings and queens who had fought for that monstrous iron throne were gone or powerless. The realm, in truth, needed someone, anyone, to wrest order from the jaws of chaos. His heart pounded in his chest. He could not quite bring himself to speak, but in the hush, the kneeling men saw his silence as acceptance. A cry went up, hesitant at first, then swelling as more voices joined. "Long live the king! Long live King Sandor!" The words rattled in his ears, almost surreal. King Sandor. The Hound. It seemed a mockery of all that he had been, but these people were uttering it as if it was their sole salvation. He wondered if the gods were laughing at him from wherever they perched, or if this was some twisted form of justice they had devised. Regardless, the hour was late, and the realm was perched on a knife's edge. Night wore on, and Sandor let himself be led, half in a daze, through the corridors of the ruined Red Keep. Their torches illuminated corridors littered with debris, shattered tapestries, and the bodies of the small folk who had died in the recent sacking. A hush followed them wherever they walked, as though the building itself recognized that a new power was passing through. Soldiers who had once sworn allegiance to the dead king saluted or bowed. Sandor's mind roiled. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting the mountain to rise from the dead. But his brother lay in the courtyard still, too large even for the men to move yet. As dawn approached, Sandor found himself in the old throne room, a place where so many had fought, bled, and died. The Iron Throne loomed ahead, dark and sinister, its melted swords twisting upward like the spines of a beast. He paused, staring at it. Memories of men who had coveted that seat flickered through his mind, all the countless lords and ladies who had died in its pursuit. He had no desire for it. The iron spikes, the cold seat, but the men behind him urged him forward. He felt a queasy sense of fate. He was too exhausted, both physically and emotionally, to resist. With slow, measured steps, he ascended the dais. The scrape of his boots against the stone echoed in that vast chamber. He reached the throne and hesitated. The people gathered behind him, the wounded city watch, and the battered lords, waited with bated breath. He lowered himself onto the Iron Throne. Its metal jutted uncomfortably against his armor, cold and unyielding. A hush fell upon them all, so profound that Sandor could hear his own heart pounding. He stared out at the hall, remembering the old days when he had stood guard, watching kings and queens do foolish, selfish things. He recalled how he had once despised them all. Now he sat where they had sat. The men bowed, some weeping openly, some trembling with fear or hope. Sandor swallowed hard. He felt neither triumph nor glory, only a grim acceptance that he was the last thing standing between the realm and total anarchy. At sunrise he was crowned by a ragged septon who had managed to survive the carnage. The ceremony was a bare-bones affair, with few relics remaining. The crown itself was a simple band of gold, salvaged from the body of a previous king's corpse. As it was placed upon his head, Sandor wondered if it was cursed. The septon's trembling voice declared him Sandor of House Clegane, protector of the realm, king of the 7 kingdoms. The retinue present repeated the words in a lifeless echo. Sandor closed his eyes, remembering how people had once referred to him as dog. Now they called him king. In the days that followed, word spread through the city. Some believed it a joke. Others whispered it was the vengeance of the gods upon the realm for its sins. But Chaos demanded swift solutions. The small council, or what remained of it, assembled. They were a sorry lot of half-terrified nobles and unscrupulous opportunists. Sandor regarded them with a sneer. He had never liked the politics of King's Landing, the endless scheming and backstabbing. Now he was supposed to command these vipers. He let them talk, their words a tangled mess of half-truths and manipulations. There were urgent matters, starving small folk, roving bands of outlaws, enemies on the borders, and lords in distant regions who might not accept the new regime. Some saw this as a chance to break away entirely from the throne. The council turned to Sandor for decisions. He found himself forced to speak. His voice was rough, direct. He wasn't one for fancy speeches. He demanded food for the small folk, demanded an immediate assessment of the city's defenses, demanded that the outlaws be hunted down. He barked orders, drawing on a lifetime of soldiering. The council listened, cowed by the knowledge that this was a man who had slain the mountain in single combat. They might have considered him uncouth, but none dared question his strength. Outside, the city reeled. Smoke still rose from burned districts. Bodies clogged the narrower streets. The city watch, disorganized and leaderless for weeks, slowly reassembled under the Hound's directive. Sandor stalked through the streets himself, seeing the desperation in the eyes of the people, hearing their cries for food and safety. Memories of the Battle of the Blackwater rose unbidden in his mind, along with the terror he had felt that night. Now, as king, he could not simply turn away. He ordered the gates open for shipments of grain. He demanded that the wealthier lords empty their granaries to feed the starving. Where gold was needed, he found it in the coffers left by the dead. Where steel was needed, he forced blacksmiths to reforge the city's broken armaments. He supervised the watch in clearing out the dead and in imposing a curfew on the city's most dangerous districts. For days he worked himself to the bone, sleeping only a few hours each night on a makeshift bed in the Red Keep. He barely ate, haunted by the thought that all of this might collapse if he showed any weakness. The council urged him to delegitimize potential rivals, to send ravens to all corners of the realm demanding fealty. He did so reluctantly, though he added that any lord who refused his summons would find him at their gates. Some of the distant lords might have laughed at the idea of the Hound on the Iron Throne, but the more prudent ones recognized the raw truth. He had killed Gregor Clegane, the unstoppable mountain, and in doing so had seized King's Landing. If they wished to avoid more bloodshed, it might be best to see what kind of king this Hound would be. The first real test of Sandor's rule came just a fortnight later, when a band of would-be tyrants, led by a disgruntled knight claiming ties to the old Targaryen line, tried to spark a rebellion in the city's slums. They roused an angry mob, promising them bread if only they would rise against the new king. Rumors spread that the Hound was hoarding food, that he was no better than the butcher kings before him. People in dire straits, half-starved and fearful, joined the mob. When word reached Sandor, he donned his armor and rode out with a detachment of the watch. The sight of him on a black horse, his scarred face illuminated by the glow of torches, struck the crowd silent with dread. He dismounted, demanded that the rabble-rouser come forward. The knight stepped forth, brandishing a sword. He shouted that a monster could never be a rightful king, that the realm needed the blood of dragons on the throne. Sandor regarded the man with a stare as cold as iron. He spoke loud enough for all to hear. He called the knight a liar, reciting that the Targaryens were gone, that the last of them had left the city in ashes. He gestured to the city watch, who distributed sacks of grain to the crowd. The restless tide of peasants hesitated. Sandor then challenged the knight to prove his claim by single combat. The knight's face went pale. A tremor of fear rippled through him as he realized he faced the man who had slain the mountain. But he had no choice but to accept if he wished to maintain his pretense of legitimacy. Their duel was swift. The knight struck first, but Sandor's experience and skill overshadowed him in seconds. With a single mighty blow, he disarmed the knight, sending his sword clattering onto the cobblestones. The crowd gasped. The watch parted, giving Sandor room. He pressed the tip of his blade against the man's throat. The knight stared up at him, terror in his eyes. Some in the crowd cried for mercy, others demanded blood. For a moment, Sandor remembered how it felt to be at someone's mercy, to be helpless. In front of the mob, he sheathed his sword and ordered the knight taken away to the cells. The crowd, seeing the grain, seeing the Hound choose not to be a butcher, slowly dispersed. The watch moved in to calm the rest and to hand out what little bread and grain they had, though it was never enough. Still, word spread that the new king had displayed both strength and an unexpected mercy. Whispers circulated that perhaps this was a different kind of king, a man who could still show some shred of humanity. The tension simmered but did not boil over that night. Sandor felt hollow afterward, but he also felt something he had never quite experienced before: responsibility. People looked to him for more than brute force. Weeks turned into months. Slowly the city stabilized. Traders returned, lured by the promise of coin in a capital that was no longer an open rebellion. Sandor found himself mired in council meetings. The stifling talk of trade agreements and supply routes bored him, but he forced himself to attend, to listen. He signed decrees, some written by the more literate members of the council, always scanning them with suspicion. He was no fool. He knew these men had their own agendas. In his rough, direct way, he called them out on any trickery he spotted. Over time, many of the sycophants were dismissed, replaced by men and women who genuinely wished to rebuild the city. The small folk noticed small changes: more watchmen patrolling the streets, fewer bribes demanded at the gates, the beginnings of repairs on the city walls. Yet not everyone accepted the Hound's kingship so easily. In the Reach, a coalition of lesser lords defied his call for fealty. In the north, rumors abounded that a new war chief was consolidating power, emboldened by the idea that a southern king of uncertain legitimacy could not truly hold the realm. Across the sea, mercenary companies licked their lips, waiting to pounce on a weakened Westeros. Sandor might have quieted King's Landing, but the realm was vast, and its fractures ran deep. The day came when the newly formed Royal Guard, men selected from the City Watch, and a handful of knights loyal to Sandor, brought word that the rebellious lords of the Reach had advanced with a small army, threatening to cut off grain supplies. The city still relied heavily on shipments from that fertile region. Should those lords succeed, the people would starve. The council, panicked, urged Sandor to send emissaries to negotiate to appease them with gold or titles. But Sandor knew appeasement would only invite more rebellions. The realm had seen countless kings show weakness and lose their crowns. He decided to ride out himself, taking a portion of the watch to meet the rebels head-on. A murmur of apprehension rippled through the capital. People remembered that the last king to march out of King's Landing in full panoply had not returned. But Sandor was relentless. He rode at the head of a column of grim-faced soldiers, men who had learned to respect his prowess in battle. Their banners were crude, hastily fashioned sigils featuring the 3 dogs of House Clegane. Citizens gathered by the roadside to watch them pass. Some spat, still seeing him as a murderer, a butcher. Others bowed their heads in a gesture of cautious hope. The swirling dust followed the procession out of the city gates. Within hours, the Red Keep was out of sight. Sandor led them south, determined to bring the rebellious lords to heel. On the march, Sandor recalled his days guarding royal brats, the sneering Joffrey, the endless folly of that court. He marveled at the irony that he was now in that position, leading an army in the name of a crown he had never wanted. He maintained discipline among his men, punishing looters swiftly, ensuring that the local small folk were not mistreated. This was no crusade of conquest, he told them, but a mission to show that the king's justice was real. Most obeyed, for the memory of the mountain's demise still lingered as a cautionary tale. It took them a fortnight to reach the outskirts of the rebels' territory, a stretch of rolling hills dotted with farmland. The rebellious lords had entrenched themselves near a once prosperous market town. Scouts reported that their numbers were roughly equal, perhaps slightly more than Sandor's force. They were led by Lord Garland Oakhearth, a minor lord notorious for shifting alliances whenever it suited him. In a hasty parley, Oakhearth demanded that Sandor renounce the throne and allow a council of Reach lords to govern independently. Sandor spat on the ground in response. He told Oakhearth that if he wanted the realm's crown, he could try taking it from him in open battle. That sparked a flare of anger in Oakhearth's eyes. He roared that the Hound was nothing but a rabid dog whose reign would end in the mud. The parley ended in threats. At dawn the next day, the 2 armies met on the gentle slope of a field that overlooked a slow-moving river. A dense fog clung to the ground, obscuring vision. Sandor positioned his men on slightly higher ground, mindful of the advantage that might bring. Drummers signaled readiness. Archers knocked arrows, their bowstrings creaking in the chill air. The rebel forces advanced first, their banners streaming overhead. Okarth rode at the front, clad in bright armor, arrogance in every line of his posture. Sandor, astride a warhorse, raised his sword. His men advanced at a measured pace, well drilled despite their origins as a ragtag watch. A clarion horn cut through the fog, and the first flight of arrows soared overhead. Sandor's horse snorted as the shafts clattered against shields and pinged off armor. The morning erupted into chaos, men shouting, swords clashing, hooves pounding. Sandor led by example, plunging into the fray with a deep bellow. His blade hacked through the spear thrusts aimed at him. Blood splashed across his armor. A wave of old memories threatened to surface, the horror, the chaos of battle. But he channeled them into raw focus, pressing forward. The rebel lines wavered under the fierce assault. Sandor's men fought with disciplined brutality, spurred on by the knowledge that they were not mere cannon fodder but the king's chosen. Sandor himself was a beacon of terror to the enemy. He cut down a knight in gilded armor, turned aside the blow of another with a swift parry. Soldiers attempted to flank him, but he wheeled his warhorse around, slashing in a sweeping arc that sent two men sprawling. The thick fog and the press of bodies made the battlefield claustrophobic. The cries of the wounded, the screams of dying horses, the roar of rushing water in the nearby river, all blended into a dissonant symphony of violence. Lord Okarth, seizing an opportunity, rallied a group of mounted knights to charge directly at Sandor. Their lances lowered, the knights thundered across the muddy field. Sandor saw them too late to reposition his men fully. He shouted for them to brace, to form a defensive line with spears, but he knew the collision could be brutal. Arrows whistled from the flanks, hitting some of the charging knights. A few toppled from their saddles, but the momentum carried the rest forward. Sandor spurred his horse, meeting them head-on before they could crash into his infantry line. The clash was ferocious. Okarth's lance shattered against Sandor's shield, the impact nearly wrenching Sandor from his saddle. Pain lanced up his arm. He gritted his teeth, dropped the broken shield, and swung his sword upward. Okarth barely deflected the blow with his own blade. Their horses circled, hooves churning the muddy ground. Okarth thrust, slicing a shallow cut across Sandor's thigh. Sandor snarled in pain, spurred his horse closer, and rained down a series of heavy strikes. Okarth struggled to parry. His armor rang like a bell under the onslaught. Finally, Sandor found a gap in Okarth's guard, driving his sword down into the man's shoulder. The lord let out a strangled cry, dropping his weapon. He tumbled from the saddle, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Sandor dismounted, limping slightly from his wounded thigh. Soldiers on both sides paused, forming a ring around them. Okarth coughed, spitting blood. In his eyes, Sandor saw the flicker of a man who suddenly realized he had gambled poorly. Okarth opened his mouth as though to beg for mercy. But the old knightly code demanded something else, a chance for surrender. Sandor stood over him, chest heaving. He thought of the city behind him, the small folk needing grain, the men who had died already in this campaign. Then he thought of how Okarth had scorned him as a rabid dog and threatened to starve the city. Sandor considered letting him live, but in that instance he saw no path forward without demonstrating that rebellion had dire consequences. He brought his sword down, ending Okarth's life in a single decisive blow. Blood stained the mud, and the hush that fell was deafening. In that moment, the rebel lines faltered. Their leader was dead, and they had already lost many men. The sight of the Hound standing there, sword dripping red, forced them into a choice: continue a hopeless fight or submit. One by one, helmets came off, swords were laid on the ground. Sandor ordered his men to accept their surrender. The day belonged to the king, and the lords of the Reach had learned the cost of defiance. Ravens carried word of the victory back to King's Landing. In the following weeks, more lords hastened to swear fealty rather than risk a similar fate. Yet victory brought with it new burdens. Now Sandor had prisoners, new lands to govern, and more mouths to feed. He returned to the capital with a grim face, leading a weary army. The people, hearing of his triumph, greeted him with subdued awe. Some cheered, especially those whose bellies might now be filled by the resecured trade routes. Others looked at him with wary eyes, uneasy about this warrior king who had shown he was not above bloody retribution. The city watch hammered his banners onto the gates, proclaiming that King Sandor had defended the realm from traitors. The merchants saw new opportunities, the small folk some measure of stability. But the rumor mills churned with tales of the Hound's ruthlessness. Some called him the just Hound, others the bloody dog. Sandor himself wanted none of it. He had done what he had to do. It did not feel like justice, only necessity. Time passed. Word arrived of the Northern War Chief, a man named Willis Manderley, who claimed to have rallied a host under the old banners of the North, threatening to cross the neck and carve out a separate kingdom. Sandor convened his council. Some advised caution, urging him to send envoys, reminding him that the North was vast and had always been fiercely independent. Others called for a preemptive strike. Sandor, weary of constant war, decided to offer negotiations first. Ravaged by conflict, the realm could ill afford to keep bleeding. He sent trusted advisors north, men who knew how to speak in that blunt, honorable way Northerners respected. And he waited, the city holding its collective breath. Those days of waiting were restless. Sandor roamed the Red Keep at night like a caged beast. He took to sparring in the courtyard with anyone brave enough to face him. His nightmares returned, images of Gregor's looming figure, of fire licking at the sides of his face. He would wake drenched in sweat, uncertain if the crown on his head was real or just a twisted dream. He found solace in occasional talks with the small folk, sometimes riding out alone in disguise to hear their plights. It was strange to him, acting in the manner of a king who actually cared. But perhaps some part of him did care. He had lived among the highborn long enough to see the damage they wrought with their indifference. He knew the cost of that to the powerless. The envoys returned with mixed news. Willis Manderley was willing to talk, but only if the king himself came north to treat with him as an equal. The council balked at the idea of the king journeying to the north, exposing himself to treachery. But Sandor, driven partly by exhaustion with the city's politicking, decided he would go. He assembled a modest retinue, enough soldiers to protect him, but not so many as to appear threatening. The journey would be arduous, but if it could secure peace with the North, it might be worth it. The alternative was another war, and Sandor had grown too familiar with the sight of young men dying for the ambitions of lords. So, on a cold autumn morning, Sandor left the Red Keep, entrusting its governance to a handful of council members he grudgingly deemed least corrupt. He set forth with knights and watchmen he had come to trust, men who had fought alongside him. The road north was bleak, the land preparing for winter's onset. At times bitter winds lashed them and storms turned the roads to mud. But Sandor pressed on, driven by a sense of duty that was altogether new to him. Along the way they passed hamlets and towns still recovering from the wars. Some places had never fully rebuilt after the arrival of Daenerys Targaryen's dragons years before. The small folk, upon seeing the royal procession, emerged cautiously, peering from shuttered windows. Sandor always halted, letting them see him clearly, his scarred face, the 3 dogs on his banner. He spoke plainly, promising them that the realm was slowly mending, that rebellion would only deepen their suffering. Most just nodded, hollow-eyed from loss and hardship. Upon crossing into the north, the chill deepened. The trees of the Wolf's Wood loomed, dark and ancient. At Moat Cailin, battered fortress of old, they found Willis Manderley's men waiting. To Sandor's surprise, the so-called war chief was not some wild-eyed barbarian, but a stout, plain-faced lord with a practical manner. Manderley welcomed Sandor in a drafty hall, far from the comfort of grand castles in the south. The tension was palpable. Manderley's guards eyed the king's men warily. Sandor, never one for courtly niceties, greeted Manderley with a curt nod. The northern lord, arms folded across his chest, regarded Sandor's scarred visage carefully, as though weighing his every twitch. The negotiations stretched for days, filled with blunt talk of trade rights, taxation, and the age-old north-south divide. Manderley insisted that the North had been left to starve in the aftermath of so many southern wars. Sandor listened, silent, occasionally offering a gruff reply. He didn't care about flowery speeches or petty power plays. He cared about whether he could keep the realm from splintering further. Slowly, a grudging respect formed between the two men. Both had known war and loss. Both were direct in their speech, disliking needless ceremony. In a rare moment of candor by the hearth, Manderley asked Sandor how a man like him became king. Sandor stared into the fire, recalling that fateful night when he slew Gregor, the look of the kneeling lords, the hollow ring of long, long live the king. He said only that the realm needed a man to kill a monster, and he happened to be that man. Eventually, Manderley admitted that the North, while proud, was not eager for another war. If Sandor could guarantee certain rights and assurances, primarily fair treatment, lower taxes, and the freedom for the North to govern itself more autonomously, they might refrain from open rebellion. Sandor agreed, seeing no point in trying to force the proud Northerners into utter submission. A document was drafted, hammered out by Manderley's scribes. In that old hall, illuminated by flickering lanterns, Sandor and Manderley both pressed their seals onto the parchment. The men present let out a breath of relief. War had been averted for now. The royal retinue spent another week as guests of Manderley, forging fragile bonds with his men. Sandor found he almost preferred the blunt North to the cunning South. There was less artifice in their dealings. On the morning of their departure, the weather turned foul. Sleet hammered the rooftops, turning the courtyard into a frozen quagmire. Yet Sandor insisted they set out. He had stayed away from King's Landing too long already. The realm still teetered on the brink. An absent king could spell fresh turmoil. Manderley parted with a handshake, cautioning that the North would be watching closely. Sandor gave a curt nod. He mounted his horse, pulling his cloak tight against the biting cold, and led his men south again. The return journey was fraught with storms. Sheets of icy rain battered them as they rode. Rivers threatened to flood their banks, forcing them to make perilous crossings. More than once, the small folk they encountered told tales of outlaws taking advantage of the inclement weather to raid isolated farms. Sandor ordered his men to intervene where they could, but their numbers were small, and the territory vast. They did what they could, driving off a gang of bandits in one hamlet, leaving behind a portion of their provisions to help feed the villagers. Some men grumbled that the king should not dirty his hands with such trifling matters, but Sandor ignored them. He remembered the devastation that war had wrought on the small folk, how no lord or king had ever truly protected them. Eventually, the royal party reached the fringes of the crown lands again. The land was drenched and the signs of recent floods scarred the countryside. Even the fields near the city walls seemed soggy, the approach slick with mud. When they finally glimpsed the outline of the Red Keep, many of Sandor's men cheered softly, relieved to be home. Sandor felt only a grim ache in his bones. He wanted a dry bed and some semblance of peace. Yet as they neared the gates, he sensed an unease in the air. The guards at the walls looked tense, their expressions drawn. A hush accompanied Sandor's entry into the city, as though King's Landing itself was holding its breath. At the Red Keep, he was greeted by the council's messenger, who wore an anxious look. The council had been wrestling with new crises in his absence. Pirates along the eastern coasts had seized merchant vessels, demanding ransom. Several lords in the Stormlands quarreled over disputed lands. More troubling still was the rumor that the Golden Company, those infamous sellswords, were massing in the disputed lands across the narrow sea, possibly with an eye on Westeros. Every direction Sandor turned, a new threat loomed. He strode into the council chambers, water dripping from his soaked cloak, mud caking his boots. The council members bowed, their voices a flurry of frantic updates. Sandor sat heavily in the high seat, wishing he could simply drift off to sleep. But that wasn't an option for a king. One matter stood above the rest. The pirates had grown bold enough to raid a port town just 2 days' sail from the capital. Traders feared they might blockade the Blackwater Bay, cutting off vital supplies. The council debated sending the royal fleet to drive them off. But the fleet was in disrepair, neglected for years. They would need coin to refit the ships, and coin was scarce. Some proposed new taxes. Others argued that might provoke another revolt. Tempers flared, voices rose. Sandor slammed his fist on the table, silencing them. He demanded to know if any ships were in good enough condition to sail immediately. One counselor mentioned a handful of galleys that had recently returned from a trading voyage. Sandor ordered them to be readied, manned by loyal soldiers who could at least scout the pirates' position and gather information. Then they would devise a plan to deal with them. The council, taken aback by his directness, agreed. Over the following days, Sandor oversaw the gathering of funds for naval repairs. He struck bargains with wealthy merchants in exchange for certain trading privileges, securing loans to refit the ships. His presence at the docks shocked many. He walked among shipwrights, blacksmiths, and sailors, listening to their gripes, promising fair pay. Rough as his manner was, People recognized that he was not the typical king who ruled from a cushioned throne. He seemed to genuinely want results. Soon, the clang of hammers and the hiss of steam filled the air as battered hulls were patched, sails mended and weapons stowed. Sandor even visited the rowers' benches to ensure they were well provisioned, remembering all too well how often men were worked to death in galleys without a second thought from the highborn. In the midst of these efforts, news arrived that the pirates had indeed begun blockading the bay, extorting ships passing through. The cost of goods in the city spiked, and tensions rose among the small folk. Council members whispered that if they failed to break the blockade, the city might starve again. Sandor knew time was short. With a handful of half-refitted ships, he decided on a daring move. Instead of waiting for a full fleet, he would sail at the head of the best galleys they had. The rest of the ships would follow as soon as they were ready. He gathered volunteers, veteran archers, knights with experience in naval skirmishes. Their morale wavered, but Sandor's presence stiffened their spines. He refused to send others into danger he wouldn't face himself. That gesture won him respect among many, if not all. They set sail on a gray morning, the sky low and heavy with clouds. The decks were cramped, the men tense. Sandor stood at the prow of the lead galley, the wind whipping his hair. Sea spray stung his scarred face, bringing back old memories of voyages during the wars. They sailed down the Blackwater, the city shrinking behind them. Hours passed before they spotted the pirate ships, a ragtag flotilla of cogs and galleys, flying no heraldry but black sails. Some battered merchant vessels floated nearby, evidently captured. Smoke curled from one that was still smoldering. Sandor felt a surge of anger at the sight of it. The pirates, seeing the king's galleys, formed a line. Their decks were crowded with men, armed with crossbows and grappling hooks. Sandor's archers readied their bows, the tension palpable. He ordered the oarsmen to increase speed, intending to ram the nearest pirate ship and create an opening. The drummers set a furious beat, and the rowers responded with a powerful surge. The galley lurched forward, cutting through the choppy waves. The wind hissed in Sandor's ears. Moments later, the first volley of crossbow bolts whistled toward them. Shields were raised. Men ducked. Some bolts slammed into the hull or clattered off shield edges. A few men cried out as they were struck. Sandor roared for the archers to return fire. Arrows streaked across the water, finding targets on the pirate decks. The two fleets converged, the sound of creaking wood and shouting men echoing across the bay. Sandor's galley crashed into a pirate ship, the impact jolting everyone aboard. Grappling hooks flew. Men leapt onto the enemy deck. Sandor was among the first, swinging his sword in a swift arc that knocked a pirate off his feet. The fighting was brutal and cramped. Blood slicked the deck, bodies fell overboard. Sandor's men pushed forward, methodically driving the pirates back. Other galleys similarly clashed with their counterparts. The water churned red in places where men had fallen. Smoke began to rise from a ship that caught fire during the chaos. Sandor pressed on, cutting down any pirate who stood in his path. His presence galvanized his men, who fought with determination. Bit by bit, the pirates' line broke. Some tried to flee, cutting ropes and rowing away. Others surrendered, throwing down their arms and begging for mercy. As the sun reached its zenith, the remaining pirate vessels scattered. A ragged cheer rose from the king's galleys. The blockade was broken. Sandor ordered the captured ships to be secured, the prisoners bound. He could already sense the next wave of challenges, dealing with the prisoners, deciding whether to offer them mercy or hang them as a warning. But for the moment, at least, the waters were free for trade again. The battered royal fleet limped back toward King's Landing, bringing the wounded and the spoils of victory. Some ships had been lost, and many men had fallen. But the city's lifeline was preserved. When the fleet docked, throngs of onlookers crowded the piers. They gawked at the captured pirate vessels, the battered men, and especially at the scarred king disembarking with grim satisfaction. Another wave of rumors spread through the capital, painting Sandor as a king who fought at the forefront, a man who refused to hide behind castle walls. Some found hope in that. Others whispered that such a king was too reckless to endure. Nevertheless, supplies soon flowed back into the city, easing tensions for a time. In the months that followed, Sandor juggled a never-ending array of crises. He adjudicated disputes among lords, stamped out the remnants of rebellious factions, and carefully stoked trade to refill the royal coffers. He found no pleasure in the trappings of royalty, no lavish feasts or grand tournaments. Instead, he poured what resources he could into strengthening the Watch, rebuilding parts of the city, and ensuring that outlaws found no foothold. Word of his direct style of governance spread beyond the capital, and slowly, some distant regions grudgingly recognized him. Dorn, typically aloof, sent envoys to gauge his intentions. The Vale showed cautious support, as long as the roads remained safe for trade. Every step was a delicate balance between force and conciliation. Amid these burdens, Sandor never forgot the ghostly weight of his brother. He had killed the mountain, but sometimes he would wake at night feeling as though Gregor was still out there, a looming shadow in the corners of his vision. The scar on his face itched in the dark, a lingering reminder of old trauma. The crown on his head often felt heavier than any helmet he had worn. His moments of rest were rare, and when he closed his eyes, he saw battlefields and burning villages. Yet he continued, motivated by a grim sense of duty, or perhaps by the faint hope that he could prevent the realm from relapsing into the horrors he had witnessed. Over time, some of the small folk began to speak of him in more favorable terms. They saw fewer brutes in the Watch demanding bribes. They witnessed their king riding into danger instead of sending others to die for him. Bakers whispered that his demand for grain distribution had prevented famine. Fishermen, relieved that pirates no longer menaced the bay, brought in larger catches. The old aristocracy, accustomed to extravagance, grumbled about his lack of refinement, but even they could not deny that the city was more stable than it had been in years. Little by little, Sandor's reputation evolved from that of a terrifying bodyguard to a hardened warrior king who, despite his rough ways, might actually be the best hope for holding the Seven Kingdoms together. When winter's grip tightened, King's Landing felt a chill it had rarely known. Storms battered the coasts, and snow occasionally dusted the rooftops. In the gloom of those shorter days, Sandor worked tirelessly. He oversaw the creation of winter stores, punishing nobles who attempted to hoard. He paced the ramparts, ensuring the walls were manned, acutely aware that times of hardship often bred revolts. Yet the city endured. Merchants still came with goods, albeit fewer. The Watch maintained order in the streets. The Red Keep echoed with the howling wind at night, but its corridors were no longer littered with unburied dead or cowering peasants. A semblance of normalcy had taken root. Still, not a day passed where someone didn't question his legitimacy. Some obscure Targaryen pretender might emerge, or rumors of dragon eggs in the east might swirl. The lords who had bowed did so out of fear more than love. But Sandor had come to understand that in the brutal world of courts and kingdoms, fear was often a more reliable currency than affection. He didn't fancy himself a hero or a savior. He was merely a man forced into a role he would never have chosen, trying to do what needed to be done so that fewer innocents suffered. In quiet moments, he wondered if that was enough. One evening, the first real snowstorm of the season raged outside the Red Keep. Sandor stood on a balcony overlooking the silent courtyard. Torchlight flickered on the freshly fallen snow, and his breath curled in the frigid air. He remembered as a young boy, trembling in fear of his brother's wrath, dreaming of escape or vengeance. How far he had come. He had slain the mountain, buried that old terror in a courtyard full of onlookers. Now, he wore a crown, a symbol of power that had once meant nothing but cruelty to him. He thought of the men and women who now looked to him for leadership, those who had come to rely on him in a way no one ever had before. It was a bitter irony, yet in his chest, he felt a flicker of something resembling purpose. Below, a single figure crossed the courtyard, bundled against the cold carrying a stack of ledgers. Likely a scribe or a steward working late. The wind whipped at them, threatening to scatter their papers. Sandor felt an odd pang, as though he wanted to go down and help, but he remained where he was. He was the king, after all, and there were appearances to maintain, or so his council constantly reminded him. The thought almost made him laugh. Appearances to maintain. He, the scarred and grim-faced man who had once spat on the notion of chivalry. Yet now he found himself mindful of the burdens and expectations that came with his newfound station. A swirl of conflicting feelings, regret, bitterness, and a sliver of pride churned within him. Retreating inside, he found his way to the throne room, empty at this hour. Only a handful of torches remained lit, casting dancing shadows across the melted swords of the Iron Throne. He walked toward it, his boots echoing in the silence. Each step brought back memories of how this had all begun. He approached the throne, running a gloved hand over one of its twisted metal edges. The iron was cold to the touch. So many had died for this seat, had lied and schemed and killed to claim it. He remembered that first night, the blood still fresh on his blade after killing Gregor, the lords kneeling in desperation. He thought he had wanted nothing but to leave it all behind, yet here he stood. And though he still felt like an outsider in a world of power and nobility, he realized that he had made a difference. If not for him, perhaps the city would have starved or burned in another uprising. Perhaps war would have consumed the north. Perhaps pirates would have strangled trade, leaving the streets full of the dead. By sheer force of will and a measure of skill, he had managed to hold it all together, however precariously. Seating himself on the throne, he stared out into the empty hall. In that solitude, he allowed himself a moment to wonder what Gregor would think if he could see him now. The mountain had embodied everything vile about lords who took what they wanted by strength alone. But Sandor was trying to be something different, no matter how meager that difference might be. The memory of his brother's body lying on the courtyard's broken stones would never fully leave him, nor would the brand of fire that had scarred his face. Yet he sensed that in the strange twists of fate, he had found some path of redemption. A gust of wind blew through the high windows, causing the torches to sputter. The Iron Throne's shadows danced across the floor, and for an instant, Sandor imagined they formed the shape of a hound. He almost smiled at the thought. He was the Hound, after all, but now the Hound was a king. He had fought for the realm not out of blind loyalty to a cruel prince or a callous lord, but out of his own sense of grim determination. Despite every scar, every nightmare, he had refused to bow to the monstrous darkness that had once defined his life. He had taken a seat that hundreds had died for, and perhaps, in doing so, he had turned it into something less monstrous. The question remained whether the realm would endure under his rule, or if, like so many before him, he would be swallowed by the same endless cycle of violence. Still, as the storm howled outside, King Sandor Clegane closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hush of the throne room envelop him. He breathed in the cold air, tasted the faint tang of burning torches. In his bones, he felt the weight of the crown, and he felt the ghosts of his past lingering just behind him. But he also felt a stubborn spark of resolve. Tomorrow he would deal with the next crisis, sign the next decree, command the next campaign if necessary. Tomorrow he would once again walk the streets to remind the city that the king was not a distant figure, but a man who stood beside them in the muck and the blood. And for now that would have to be enough. He was king by the edge of his sword, by the spilled blood of his brother, and by the desperate faith of a realm on the brink. Perhaps the day would come when someone better, someone more suited to rule, would rise. Perhaps the realm would find its rightful heir. But until that day, he would be the Hound, and he would see that no one, no man, no monster, would again reduce him or this realm to ashes. If the gods were just, they would grant him the strength to maintain this peace. And if they were unkind, he would walk into that darkness with teeth bared, fighting until his last breath to prove that he was more than just a killer, more than just a dog. He was Sandor Clegane, the king who slew the mountain, and for better or worse, he was the shield that stood between the 7 kingdoms and the nightmares that plagued it. And in that silent hall of iron swords and flickering torchlight, for one brief moment, he believed that might be enough. Sandor Clegane did not linger long in that silent throne room. The night's chill etched itself into his bones, and he felt an old, familiar restlessness gnawing at him. There was always the next danger, the next threat poised to tear away the fragile hold he had on this kingdom. Rising from the Iron Throne, he stepped down from the dais, the echoes of his boots lost in the hush. In the corridor, a pair of guards snapped upright. He grunted, waved them away, and strode toward his private chambers, his cloak flapping behind him like a living shadow. Morning came with an ashen sky. A pale sun struggled through the high windows as Sandor finished dressing in his austere garments, a simple black tunic, dark trousers, and sturdy boots. Over this he strapped a sword belt bearing the king's blade, forged anew from the remnants of a once broken sword he had confiscated. Unlike the finery of past kings, He kept his attire practical. Symbolism could move men, but in his experience, steel and sweat won their respect far more convincingly. He had dismissed the idea of wearing a crown except for ceremonial occasions. The gaudy band of gold still sat in the council chamber, a reminder that kingship was a burden he wore only by necessity. Still sore from old wounds and the countless battles that had marked his rise, he made his way to the courtyard. The Red Keep's stables were bustling with activity, knights arriving with dispatches, city watchmen awaiting orders, stable boys trying to keep the horses calm in the winter's morning chill. Sandra's warhorse, a big coal-colored destrier with scars to match his own, stood ready. The stablemaster bowed as Sandor approached. Sandor ignored the gesture, patting the animal's flank, his breath turning to steam in the cold air. He noted the animal's flickering ears, the restless stomping of its hooves. The horse was as uneasy as its rider. "Your Grace," said a young squire, stepping forward timidly. "Shall I?" "Go on then," Sandor muttered, jerking his chin at the saddle. The boy nodded, carefully adjusting the straps. Sandor turned away to see the captain of the royal guard approaching. The man was tall and lean, with a short brown beard and a watchful expression. Though he was no green recruit, the weight of the new responsibilities had etched fresh lines in the captain's face. He bowed in that half-stiff way that men did when they were unsure of Sandor's response. "Word just arrived, Your Grace," he said. "Another small band of outlaws has been sighted north of the Roseret. They're preying on travelers." "Now," Sandor inhaled slowly. "I'll lead a patrol myself." "Your Grace," the captain began, clearly uneasy. "Are you certain? The storms have made the roads near impassable, and we still have pressing matters with the Golden Company to the east." We do," Sandor interrupted. "But these outlaws won't vanish just because we have bigger problems. If the road to the Reach isn't safe, traders won't bring their goods, then we'll have riots on our hands again, come spring." He looked the captain in the eye. "Send out a company of the watch. We'll be back by tomorrow night if the roads hold." "Now, do you know?" "Yes, Your Grace," the captain said, bowing again, then spinning on his heel to gather the men. Sandor couldn't quite get used to people calling him Your Grace. Sometimes the old him still wanted to lash out at such displays of deference, to bark at them that he was just a dog, a scarred sellsword who had ended up on a throne by killing a monster. But he held his tongue. He had learned to live with the trappings of power, understanding that a certain formality was expected, nay required, if he was to keep order among men too accustomed to kowtowing to rank. Within the hour, a small mounted detachment was assembled at the courtyard gates. 15 men, plus a handful of scouts. Sandor swung himself into the saddle with a grunt. His thigh still ached from an old battle wound, but he ignored it. The memory of that fight, of Lord Oakhearth and the rebels in the Reach, still lingered. His victory had been bloody, and he had shown them no quarter in the end. The realm had never forgotten. He surveyed the men, noting the mix of experienced watchmen and younger knights. They were armed with spears and short swords, wearing cloaks over boiled leather. They eyed him with guarded respect, still not entirely sure how to behave around a king who insisted on leading every dangerous foray himself. Sandor grunted for them to form up, and they rode out through the massive gates, hooves clopping on cold stone. Beyond the walls lay King's Landing, cramped houses, muddy streets, the morning bustle of shops and stalls. People turned to watch the column pass. Some bowed, some simply stared, uncertain whether to greet this king or to fear him. The city soon gave way to the open road, sloping fields dusted with snow. Drab winter grass crunched beneath the horses' hooves. The air carried a damp chill, and the clouds hung low, hinting at more sleet or snow later in the day. Here, away from the city's suffocating walls, Sandor felt a tiny measure of relief. The horizon was vast, unbroken by towers or crowds. The men rode in a loose column behind him, scanning the empty countryside. Now and again they passed a lonely traveler or a farmer's wagon. At each meeting they asked if the travelers had heard of raiders or seen anything suspicious. One old man in a donkey cart reported hearing a scream 2 nights ago from some ways off, near a copse of oak trees. Another man had found a ruined campsite, though he wasn't sure who it belonged to. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had thickened. A slow drizzle began, slicking the road with mud. The men pressed on, grim-faced. Sandor wiped water from his brow. He had spent much of his life in the open air, marching with armies, riding as a guard. Strange how being cooped up in the Red Keep for too long sometimes suffocated him more than the darkest nights in the field ever had. He might be a king, but out here in the slanting rain, he felt more in his element, closer to the Hound he once was. Toward evening, they found signs of violence. A partially burned wagon overturned in a shallow ditch, its contents strewn about. A pair of muddy footprints, one booted, the other bare, trailed off toward a clump of trees. Crows scattered from the wreck as the king's detachment approached, cawing irritably. Sandor dismounted and walked around the debris, prodding at the wagon with his sword's tip. He spotted a broken chest, its lock smashed open. Grain had spilled into the mud, soaking and useless now. The men spread out, scanning the surrounding area. "Over here," one scout called, his voice muffled by the steady drizzle. Sandor trudged over, boots squelching in the mire, finding the scout crouched at the base of an oak. Beneath the tangled roots, half concealed by leaves and brush, lay a woman's body. Her throat had been cut, eyes still open in an expression of mortal terror. She was young, dressed in peasant garb, with a face that reminded Sandor uncomfortably of so many other dead he had seen. He scowled, sheathing his blade. "Bloody bastards," he muttered. One of the younger knights, clearly troubled by the sight, muttered a prayer under his breath. Sandor reached down and gently closed the dead woman's eyes. Another life taken by the realm's lawlessness. He felt a flicker of anger, the same rage that used to drive him in battle. It was no simpler now that he wore a crown. "They can't have gone far," said the scout. "This can't be more than half a day old." Sandor stood, wiping mud from his glove. "We follow their trail if there is one." They found footprints heading northwest, deeper into the rolling countryside, away from the main road. Sunset was near, but Sandor refused to turn back. They pursued, pushing their horses to a trot through the worsening rain. At times the mud threatened to swallow a hoof or send a horse stumbling. Twice, a watchman's mount nearly went lame, but Sandor's growl and the men's determination to catch the killers drove them onward. Dusk arrived in a sodden gloom. The trail became harder to read. Rain hammered the fields, turning them into a swamp. Still, the scouts pressed on, searching for broken branches, footprints and patches of firmer ground, any sign of the outlaws' passage. At last they spotted a faint column of smoke rising from behind a low hill. Sandor halted the column and gestured for silence. They dismounted, tying their horses to a stand of saplings. Through the drizzle they approached the crest of the hill on foot. A small hollow lay beyond, where the remains of an abandoned farmhouse crouched in the mud. Its roof had collapsed in places, and the windows were black, gaping holes. A meager campfire flickered in the yard, partially sheltered by what had once been a barn. Even from a distance, Sandor could see figures huddled around it. He motioned for his men to spread out, circling silently. The watchers nodded, setting their jaws. They moved carefully, boots sinking into the mud. One of the watchers broke through the brush on the far side, flanking the house. Another pair crept closer to the barn. Sandor himself crouched behind a jagged stone wall, peering through the gloom. He counted 6 men around the fire, though there could be more inside. The wind shifted, carrying voices, drunken laughter, coarse jokes, the shuffle of feet. Sandor's anger flared again at the thought of the dead woman in the oak's roots. Slowly, he unsheathed his sword. The watchers on the far side gave him a nod, confirming they were in position. Sandor rose to his full height and strode forward through the open, the rain-soaked grass tugging at his boots. The outlaws noticed him too late. One cried out, fumbling for a sword. Another scrambled to his feet, kicking embers into the mud. Sandor's men emerged from the darkness, weapons drawn. Sandor wasted no time. He closed in on the nearest outlaw, an older man with a scar across his cheek. The man barely had his dagger out before Sandor's blade sank into his chest. Blood mixed with rain, spattering the ground. The barn erupted into chaos. 2 outlaws lunged at the men who had come from the flank. Another tried to flee around the corner only to meet a watchman's spear. Sandor parried a wild swing from a younger bandit, catching the man's forearm with a backslash. The bandit shrieked, dropping his blade. Sandor kicked him square in the chest, sending him sprawling into the mud. Nearby, One of the watchmen cried out as an outlaw's axe bit into his thigh. Another watchman rushed forward, driving his sword into that outlaw's back. At the barn's threshold, one more outlaw appeared, thick-set, with a stubbly beard and a savage gleam in his eyes. He swung a woodsman's axe, nearly catching Sandor's shoulder. Sandor twisted aside, feeling the rush of air. Without pause, he slammed his pommel into the outlaw's face, feeling bone crunch under the blow. The man reeled, spitting blood. Sandor ended him with a thrust through the gut. In moments, it was over. The outlaws lay dead or dying, save for one who knelt in the mud, clutching a wound. The watchman swiftly disarmed him, forcing him to his knees. The campfire flickered weakly, half doused by the rain, illuminating the carnage. Sandor stepped through the mud, counting bodies. 6 men, all accounted for. One of his watchmen knelt beside a wounded comrade, pressing a cloth to the man's bleeding leg. Breathing heavily, Sandor turned to the captured outlaw. "You were the ones who attacked the wagon on the Rosarat." The man coughed, rain streaming down his face. "We took what we needed." "You needed to cut a woman's throat?" Sandor's voice was low, trembling with anger. The outlaw flinched. He glanced at the dead around him, then at Sandor's scarred face. "We're hungry. Times are hard," he said through gritted teeth. Sandor's lips curled in disgust. He looked to the watchman. "Tie him to that post." They hauled the man to his feet, dragging him to a half-rotted fence post near the barn. He struggled feebly, then seemed to realize there would be no escape. One of the watchmen found a length of rope in the debris and bound him securely. Sandor approached, sword still in hand but pointed at the ground. Rain dripped off his hair, tracing the contours of the old burn scars. "What do you know of times being hard?" he muttered. "You think I haven't seen men starve or shiver in the snow or lose everything to war? I've seen it all, and I've never cut a helpless woman's throat for a sack of grain." The outlaw spat. "You're the king, aren't you? Rich with gold, safe behind walls. What do you know of real hunger?" "No." A bitter laugh tore itself from Sandor's throat. "You think that's how it is? Think again. You want to see my walls? They've done nothing but keep me chained." He lifted his sword. "You took a life for nothing. I should kill you for it." The man's eyes flickered with panic, but he clenched his jaw. "Go on then. You're no different from the rest. This realm's always been ruled by those with swords. You'll kill me as easy as stepping on an ant, because that's what kings do." Sandor stared at him. The memory of the Targaryens, the Lannisters, all those who once sat the Iron Throne, and all the nameless dead who had paid the price for their cruelty, weighed on him. Was he truly different? Or was he just another man with a crown, executing those who defied him? A watchman cleared his throat. "Shall we string him up, your grace?" The outlaw's breath caught in his throat. He looked between Sandor and the watchman. Sandor's gaze bore into the man. "No," he said at last, his voice rasping. "Not like this." He turned to the watchman. "We bring him back. Let the city see what becomes of murderers." "Nah." The watchman hesitated, then nodded. One retrieved a gag from his pouch and shoved it roughly into the outlaw's mouth. The man tried to protest, but he was muffled. Sandor stepped back, breathing shakily. He realized that some part of him wanted to cut the man down where he stood. But another part, a part that had grown since he took the throne, demanded something else. A semblance of justice, public, visible, not just the edge of a sword in the rain. They searched the barn and the farmhouse for supplies or other survivors, but found none. Just rotting beams, broken furniture, and more evidence that these outlaws had been living here for weeks, scavenging, robbing, and killing. With the rain intensifying, there was nothing more to do but leave this wretched place. The watchman wrapped the wounded comrade's leg and Sandor helped hoist him onto a horse. They left 2 outlaws' corpses unburied, the others half submerged in the mud. Sometimes the realm reeked of death no matter what he did. The ride back to King's Landing was slow and miserable. Night pressed in on them, and the muddy roads made travel perilous. More than once a horse nearly slipped, sending its rider cursing into the darkness. The captured outlaw was tied across a spare horse's saddle, head lolling with each jolt. By the time they saw the city lights glimmer in the distance, fatigue and cold had settled deep into everyone's bones. At the gate, the guards on night watch were startled to see the king himself returning, caked in mud. They saluted smartly, opening the way. Inside, Sandor ordered the outlaw thrown in the darkest, dampest cell in the Red Keep's dungeons. The watchmen carried off their wounded to the maesters, while others guided the horses to the stables. Sandor trudged up the steps, hardly noticing the water trailing from his cloak. Servants gawked but kept their distance, uncertain whether to offer help or remain silent. In his personal chambers, he stripped off the sodden garments and sank onto a wooden chair by the brazier, letting the warmth seep into his tired limbs. A servant brought a steaming bowl of stew and a cup of watered wine. Sandor stared into the stew, appetite dulled by what he had seen. Still, he forced himself to eat. Kings starve no faster than commoners, but the realm needed him alert. He scraped the wooden spoon across the bowl, swallowing the chunks of meat and vegetables. The simple meal tasted almost bitter to him. After finishing, he slumped back in the chair, too exhausted to even remove his boots. Sleep tugged at him, but his mind whirled. He saw again the body of that dead woman under the oak roots, the blood mingling with the wet leaves. He saw again the sneer on the outlaw's face when he spat accusations. Finally, with the brazier's heat on his skin, he drifted into a restless doze. Nightmares plagued him, flickering images of his brother's face, half hidden by that monstrous helmet, the courtyard where he had ended him, the swirl of choking dust, and the hush of a crowd kneeling. Then the nightmares shifted to images of rotting corpses in a battlefield, of a castle wall collapsing into flame. Always, he was reaching for something he could not grasp. When he awoke, the chamber's brazier had burned low. Thin gray light filtered through the shutters. He stirred, groaning softly at the stiffness in his neck. A dull ache throbbed in his thigh wound. Outside, the city was rousing, the horns sounding the dawn watch. He rose, shedding the last of his travel-stained clothes, and allowed a servant to bring hot water for a quick washing. After dressing in fresh garments, he strode down to the council chambers, feeling the old knot of tension in his belly return. The day's tasks awaited, and they would not be few. The council was already there. Some members stood, exchanging hushed words, while others were seated, hunched over documents and ledgers. When Sandor entered, they turned, bowing in unison. He caught sight of their expressions: apprehension, a bit of fear. They had no illusions about his temper, nor about what had happened the previous night. Word had a way of traveling fast in the Red Keep. Sandor dropped into the tall-backed chair at the head of the table. One of the council members, Lord Lambert, cleared his throat nervously. "Your Grace," he began, "we have news from our scouts in the Narrow Sea. The Golden Company's ships have put into Port Inlet to resupply. There are rumors they may soon sail for Westeros." A low murmur spread around the table. Sandor's gaze flickered across their faces. The Golden Company, the infamous sellsword army, once loyal to exiled Targaryens, then shifting allegiances as coin demanded. He had heard rumors they were regrouping. If they landed with a claimant or their own ambitions, it could spark another war. "How many men do they have?" Sandor asked, voice rough with fatigue. Lord Lambert pursed his lips. "Our best estimate is 8,000 foot, possibly more, plus cavalry. They have a fleet of war galleys as well." Sandor exhaled through his nose. 8,000 He could muster more from across the realm if the lords remained loyal, but that was a big if. And the Golden Company was well trained, disciplined, and hardened by years of campaigns. Another counselor, Lady Saria, spoke up. "We might negotiate with them, Your Grace. The Golden Company are sellswords. They fight for gold above all. If we pay them more than whoever hires them, we might avoid their invasion entirely." Sandor's jaw tensed. "And where do we find this gold? The royal coffers aren't exactly overflowing." The master of coin, a thin man named Grayson, nodded hastily. "Our coffers have recovered somewhat, but not enough to outbid a wealthy patron should one exist. The crown can't afford another steep loan right now. We're still repairing the fleet after the pirate blockade, and collecting taxes has been challenging." Sandor glanced at the table where maps lay scattered. What if they've aligned themselves with one of the Targaryen pretenders we keep hearing about, or some other claimant who wants the throne? "That is certainly possible," Lord Lambert said, anxiety coloring his tone. "No one's seen a dragon in these parts for years, but rumors swirl that an exiled Targaryen princess still lives in the east, or that there's some distant relative with a claim. The Golden Company was once rumored to be loyal to the Blackfires too, generations past. They have a history of supporting Targaryen offshoots. Sandor's lips pressed into a thin line. He remembered the devastation the Targaryen Queen's dragons had brought to King's Landing once upon a time. Though the city had survived, it bore scars still. And he bore memories of that conflagration, of the unstoppable fury of dragonfire. He hated fire more than anything, for reasons seared into his face. "Make no mistake," Sandor said quietly. "I won't allow them to land without resistance. We'll strengthen our fleet, keep watch on the coasts. If they send envoys, we'll hear them. But if they land in force, they'll face the entire might of the realm. Whatever that might is worth." Some of the council members exchanged glances. They knew as well as he did that many lords had only given lukewarm fealty. But no one wanted a foreign sellsword company coming to conquer them. Perhaps that fear would bind the realm together, if only for a time. Lord Lambert nodded. "We'll continue to gather intelligence, Your Grace, and we'll send messages to the major ports, warning them to remain vigilant." Sandor leaned back in his chair, feeling the familiar coil of dread in his gut. Another threat on the horizon. Would it never end? He closed his eyes briefly, remembering the vow he had made to himself. As long as he wore this crown, he would do whatever it took to protect these lands, no matter the cost. He opened his eyes, scanning the council. What else? Saria hesitated. "There is a letter from Sunspear, in Dorne. The Prince of Dorne has written to request a formal alliance, a marriage alliance to be precise." The silence deepened. Sandor stared at her. He had never considered marriage. He was no young lord, eager to sire heirs and forge alliances. He was a scarred man, well past the bloom of youth, who had spent most of his life as a killer. The notion of wedding for political gain felt alien. Yet alliances were the currency of stability. Saria continued delicately. "He suggests a match between you and his niece, Lady Nymella. She is said to be beautiful, educated, and well-liked in Dorne. They are willing to bring a sizable dowry, and more importantly Dorne's loyalty in any conflict. It could be a great boon, Your Grace." Sandor's mouth twitched. Marriage. He had never wanted a wife, never imagined someone would want him for a husband. His eyes darted from face to face, reading their expressions. The idea clearly excited some of them. A union with Dorne would secure the southern flank, ensure that no Dornish armies would join any pretenders. They could combine forces against the Golden Company if it landed. He knew how valuable that would be strategically. But the thought of wedding a woman he'd never met, for reasons no deeper than politics, made him uneasy. He had no illusions about romantic love. He had once believed in nothing but harsh reality. Yet somewhere in the recesses of his mind, an old memory of Sansa Stark flickered, the girl he had tried to protect, for reasons he could never fully articulate. The notion of gentleness, of something pure, had always felt beyond his reach. But now he was a king, and kings were often expected to forge marriage alliances. He pushed the thought away. "I'll consider it," he said gruffly. "Have the prince's messenger remain in the city until I decide." Saria nodded, seeming relieved to have an answer of any sort. Another council member launched into a diatribe about trade disputes in the Vale. Sandor forced himself to listen, though his mind drifted to the logistics of an alliance with Dorne and the looming threat of the Golden Company. The next hour passed in a swirl of reports, allocations of funds, petitions from lords and merchants. By the time the meeting ended, his head throbbed. He rose without ceremony, leaving the council to squabble among themselves about minor details. A steward tried to hand him a parchment listing upcoming audiences in the throne room, but Sandor waved it away. He needed air. Stepping outside onto a terrace that overlooked the city, he felt the sharp bite of winter wind on his face. The rooftops below were dusted with the morning's wet snow, which was now more slush than ice. Smoke rose from countless chimneys, giving the city an air of bustling industry. He rested his hands on the stone railing, exhaling a plume of vapor. His scarred face caught the diffused sunlight, and he squinted against the glare reflecting off the clouds. The Golden Company might be weeks away, or they might never come if they found a better contract. The lords of the realm might rally to him, or they might see an opportunity to betray him. He had no illusions. Fear kept them in line, but fear was fickle. A footstep behind him broke his reverie. He turned to see Maester Eldon, an elderly man with a stooped back, crossing the terrace. The chain around his neck clinked softly, its links representing the many fields of knowledge he had studied. He carried a small bundle of scrolls and looked slightly out of breath from climbing the stairs. "Your Grace," Maester Eldon said, offering a respectful bow. "I've been searching for you. There is news of the man we captured last night, the outlaw." Sandor straightened. "What of him?" The Maester swallowed. "He died in the night. The dungeons are cold and damp, and his wound must have been worse than it seemed. There was little we could do by the time the jailer summoned me." Nilshal. Sandor felt a stab of annoyance, or perhaps it was regret. He had wanted to make an example of the man, to hold a public trial, to show that justice was not merely the sword's edge. But the wretch had died before that could happen. "Burn the body, or bury it in some pauper's field," Sandor said. "If he has family, let them claim him. Though I doubt it." Maester Eldon inclined his head. "Yes, Your Grace. Also, I have these." He lifted the scrolls. "Ravens arrived this morning from the Eyrie and from Storm's End." Sandor sighed, gesturing for the Maester to follow him back inside. They entered a smaller solar off the terrace, a warm chamber with tapestries lining the walls. Sandor sank into a chair, nodding for the Maester to present the scrolls. The old man adjusted his chain, then unrolled the messages one by one. "From the Eyrie," he began, peering through half-moon spectacles. "Lord Jan Royce writes that bandits have been harrying the mountain passes. They ask for support from the crown to quell these brigands, who may have come down from the mountains of the moon. Lord Royce also sends his regards and hopes the realm remains united." Neniatzak. Sandor snorted. More outlaws. They sprang up like weeds wherever chaos lingered. "Send a reply. Tell him the crown will provide what support it can, but remind him the Vale must secure its own borders too. If he needs more arms and armor, we can arrange shipments from the city for a fair price." Eldon nodded and reached for the second scroll. "From Storm's End, Lord Bearing-Storm requests an audience. He claims the Stormlands require a higher allowance of grain this winter due to poor harvests, or he'll struggle to feed his people. He also expresses concern about pirates still active near Cape Wrath." "No." Sandor frowned. The Stormlands had always been battered by fierce weather, but they were also proud and known for their resilience. Asking for grain from the crown. That was unusual. "Tell him to come if he wants an audience. But I'll not deplete our reserves without proof of his claim. As for pirates, we already have our hands full with the Golden Company. Let him fortify his own coasts. We'll send a few war galleys if we have them to spare, but that's all." The Maester took notes diligently. Then he paused, glancing at the final scroll. "This one arrived without a seal, brought by a traveler from the west. We aren't sure of its origin." He unrolled it carefully, revealing a hastily written message. Eldon's eyes flicked across the text, and a troubled look came over his face. "Well," Sandor prompted. The Maester hesitated. "It speaks of unnatural creatures, Your Grace. The traveler claims to have met a man from the far north, a ranger of the Night's Watch possibly, who spoke of walking corpses beyond the wall." "Nator teams." Sandor stared at him, exasperated. "Is that so? And next you'll tell me the White Walkers are returning." "That is precisely what it implies," Eldon said, voice subdued. "The writing is chaotic, but it mentions a warning, something about an ancient darkness stirring, that the winds of winter bring more than just snow. It's signed with a mark I don't recognize." Sandor shook his head. He had heard such stories before, rumors of the undead and frost demons. They had circulated during the last great wars, when the dead were said to have risen in the north. But that was years ago. Many believed that threat had been vanquished, or else was but a myth spun to terrify the gullible. He felt a shiver crawl along his spine, unbidden. Fire frightened him. The idea of an army of the dead was so outlandish that he had never truly believed it until those rumors, half a decade past, had triggered a panic in the north. Still, the realm had survived. Dragons had flown, kings had fallen, but life had gone on. "Send it to the archives," Sandor said, waving a dismissive hand. "We have enough real threats without chasing ghosts." Maester Eldon nodded, though he still wore a grave expression. He gathered the scrolls and bowed himself out of the solar. Sandor remained, hunched in the chair, staring at the dancing flames in the hearth. A realm as large as the 7 kingdoms never slept, never truly knew peace. He had to choose which perils demanded attention. The Golden Company was more immediate than legends of ice wraiths. Perhaps it was foolish to ignore any sign of danger, but he had no men to spare for the far north, and the Night's Watch was but a skeleton of its former self. If the dead truly walked, it would be the North's burden first. He rubbed his temples, willing away the headache. Outside, the day had brightened marginally, sunlight reflecting off the puddles in the courtyard below. He decided he needed to address the moot question of a marriage alliance with Dorn. Uniting the realm could hinge on forging ties with every region, and Dorn had long been a thorn or a boon, depending on how one treated it. Perhaps this Lady Nymella was the key to stability. Or perhaps it was a trap, a way for Dorn to gain influence. Still, in the great Game of Thrones, alliances mattered as much as swords. Pushing himself from the chair, he went to find the steward who managed royal correspondence. The steward, a wiry man named Ander, bowed hurriedly when Sandor approached. "Your Grace," Ander said, voice quavering. "How may I serve?" "I want to see the messenger from Dorn," Sandor said. "Bring him to the antechamber, and fetch the Master of Protocol, or whatever fool can handle official greetings. I'll hear what he has to say about this marriage alliance." Ander blinked. "Yes, Your Grace, right away." He hurried off, nearly colliding with a passing guard in his haste. Sandor snorted. He had never grown used to how people seemed perpetually frightened of him. Some part of him thought that was just as well. A measure of fear kept the sycophants from becoming too bold. Within the hour, Sandor found himself in the antechamber, a high-ceilinged room decorated with sparse banners. Usually it served as a waiting area for those petitioning the throne. A small group of watchers stood guard at the walls, stoic and silent. Sandor stood near the fireplace, arms folded, as a young Dornish messenger was brought in. The man was slender, olive-skinned, with dark eyes and a nervous energy. He wore a light cloak of orange and gold, the colors of House Martell. Upon seeing the king, he sank into a low bow, one hand crossing his chest. "Your Grace, I am Corin Uller, here on behalf of Prince Cos Martell of Dorn," the man said smoothly. "I bring his sincere greetings and the hope of forging a closer bond between Dorn and the crown." Sandor inclined his head. "So I've heard. Your prince wants me to wed his niece." Corin smiled, showing white teeth. "Lady Nymella Sand, yes. Though a Sand by birth, she is of true Martell blood, a cousin to the prince. She's well versed in the arts of statecraft and diplomacy, accomplished in riding and hawking, and famed for her beauty. Prince Cos believes that a marriage between Your Grace and Lady Nymella would strengthen ties and ensure that Dorn stands firmly with the crown." "Now?" Sandor eyed the man. "And in exchange Dorn would expect what? Guarantees of independence? Lower taxes on Dornish wine? A seat on my council?" Corin spread his hands in a gesture of humility. "Dorn seeks only partnership, Your Grace. We have always maintained a certain autonomy, but we recognize the need for unity under a strong ruler, especially in these uncertain times. Prince Cos will bring a dowry of gold and trade incentives. If you accept, he will also pledge 1,000 spears to defend King's Landing should any enemy approach." "Nay, Adnadi. 1,000 spears. That was not a trivial number." Sandor's mind spun with possibilities. The Golden Company would not be so quick to land if they knew the crown was allied with Dorn. Even the other regions might be less inclined to rebel, seeing him strengthen ties with a proud and often rebellious province. But the notion of wedding a woman he had never met still twisted his gut. He remembered a younger version of himself, mocking the idea of chivalry and courtly romance. Now, it was politics that demanded the final word. He fixed Corin with a hard stare. "And if I refuse?" Corin dipped his head. "Prince Cos would respect Your Grace's decision. Dorn would remain neutral, neither friend nor foe. He cannot promise further support if your enemies come knocking, but nor would he aid them. However, he hopes it will not come to that." Sandor grunted. A polite threat, couched in diplomatic terms. Allies or not, Dorn would keep to itself unless the crown forged stronger bonds. He thought of the storms gathering on the horizon. He needed every advantage. Perhaps, for the good of the realm, for the people who depended on him, He should do what kings had done for centuries. Seal alliances with marriage. Tell your prince I need time, Sandor said at last. I won't make a decision without meeting her. If Lady Nymella is agreeable, I'll invite her to King's Landing. We can speak in person, see if we can stand each other. He paused, then added dryly, I'm not the type to put on airs. Corin bowed. Of course, your grace. I will dispatch a raven at once. Prince Koz and Lady Nymella will be most delighted by your openness. I stand ready to assist in any way. Neutrally. Sandor dismissed the messenger with a wave. For a long moment after Corin left, he stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames. A marriage alliance. He couldn't imagine himself playing the role of a regal husband, presiding over feasts and exchanging niceties. He had never been that man. Yet perhaps Lady Nymella would be strong-willed, clever, someone who understood the realities of the realm. He had no use for simpering courtiers or vain ladies obsessed with gowns. He needed an ally, not a decoration. Eventually, he shook himself from his thoughts and returned to the daily grind of kingship. Petitions in the throne room, official decrees, disputes between merchants. He waded through them all with grim determination. The days blurred. The captured outlaw had died, so he staged a public condemnation of banditry anyway, letting the city watch display the outlaw's severed head as a warning. It was a crude measure, but fear worked more swiftly than any gentle sermon. Reports trickled in of reduced robberies on the Roserad, at least for a time. Winter's grip tightened. A spate of storms lashed the coasts. The royal fleet continued its repairs, and newly hired sailors bolstered its ranks. The city's granaries filled slowly, thanks to trade deals hammered out with the Reach. Deals sealed in large part by Sandor's earlier campaign against the rebellious lords. The small folk began to see bread prices stabilize, though it was still a lean season. Occasionally, food riots threatened, but the Watch, under strict orders, maintained order without excessive brutality. Sandor saw to that personally. Then came the day a raven arrived from Dorne with word that Lady Nymella would soon journey to King's Landing. The message was formal yet warm, expressing her anticipation of meeting the king who had proven himself in battle and leadership alike. For the next 2 weeks, the city buzzed with speculation. Whispers circulated among the nobility that the Hound would soon take a Dornish bride. Some found it laughable, a scarred warrior king with a refined lady from the deserts of Dorne. Others saw it as a brilliant stroke of politics. Sandor ignored the gossip, focusing on ensuring the roads south were safe for her arrival. The last thing he needed was an ambush on the princess's cousin, which would surely scuttle any hope of alliance. At last, the day came. A small procession of Dornish riders appeared at the city gates under the fluttering banner of the Sun and Spear. Word raced ahead of them, and a modest welcoming party formed in the outer courtyard, a handful of lords and ladies, the master of protocol, and a few members of the royal guard. Sandor waited with them, arms folded, wearing dark armor polished for the occasion. He felt a prickle of discomfort, like an itch beneath his skin. Formal greetings were not his forte, but he'd make the effort for the sake of diplomacy. Trumpets sounded as the Dornish party entered. Leading them was Corin Uller again, a smile plastered on his face, followed by several knights in distinctive copper-hued armor. Then came the carriage, ornate but not ostentatious, bearing the Martell sigil. As it rolled to a stop, guards hurried to assist. Sandor stood a few steps away, eyes narrowed, bracing himself for a woman who might recoil at his scars, or faint at the sight of the city's gloom. The carriage door opened, and Lady Nymella stepped down. She was taller than he expected, her dark hair braided in a coronet, her skin sun-kissed in the Dornish fashion. She wore a crimson gown trimmed with gold, a warm cloak of sable over her shoulders. Her features were delicate yet composed, almond-shaped eyes, a determined set to her mouth. At first glance, she did not flinch at the sight of Sandor, though her gaze flickered momentarily across his scars. She inclined her head, a regal gesture that hinted at confidence rather than fear. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying a slight Dornish lilt. "I bring you greetings from my uncle Prince Koz and all of Dorne. Thank you for welcoming me to your city." Sandor found himself momentarily at a loss for words. He had half expected some fragile girl, but Lady Nymella stood before him with a presence that rivaled any highborn lady he'd seen. "Welcome to King's Landing," he managed, his voice gruff. Pleased to have you here. She gave a small smile. I trust the roads were made safe, as your men assured us. We met no troubles. He nodded. Good. Then, after a pause, I'll show you to the Red Keep. You must be tired from the journey. Graciously, she accepted. The assembled lords and ladies bowed as she passed, and the royal guard formed a half-circle around them. Sandor led her through the gates, noticing how she cast her gaze over the city with curiosity rather than repulsion. Many visitors found King's Landing dirty and crowded, especially compared to the shining spires of Sunspear, or the airy heights of the Eyrie. But Lady Nymella seemed fascinated, leaning slightly out of the carriage window to observe the bustle. When they reached the Red Keep's inner courtyard, servants rushed forward to take luggage and direct the Dornish knights to their quarters. Sandor offered Lady Nymella a hand to descend from the carriage. She placed her gloved fingertips upon his, meeting his eyes with composure. He felt a jolt of awareness. He was not used to such contact, especially from a highborn lady who did not shrink at his disfigurement. The master of protocol cleared his throat, about to launch into a formal greeting, but Sandor cut him off with a glance. He turned to Nymella, voice low. I imagine you'd like to settle in, perhaps rest. Later we can speak more privately. She inclined her head. Thank you, Your Grace. That would be most welcome. With that, servants guided her to the chambers prepared for her and her retinue. Sandor watched her depart, noting the confidence in her bearing. He faced men thrice her size in battle, but her quiet self-assurance was something else altogether. If the gods had a sense of humor, they were surely enjoying the spectacle of the Hound courting a Dornish lady. In the days that followed, Lady Nymella's presence at court created a stir. She was polite to the lords and ladies, yet not overly deferential. She engaged in discussions about trade routes, the weather in Dorne, and the complexities of navigating the stormy waters off the Dornish coast. She showed genuine curiosity about King's Landing's markets, even visiting them once under heavy guard, returning with small tokens of local craftsmanship. Each evening, Sandor found himself enduring a formal supper with her and a handful of courtiers who sought to observe their interactions. He found the suppers awkward. He was a poor conversationalist, and the endless politeness grated on him. Yet Nymella never showed impatience or disgust. She asked him measured questions about his reign, about the city, about the hardships of winter in the Crownlands. He answered in curt, honest phrases, neither embellishing nor hiding the realm's struggles. On the third evening, after enduring another round of polite chatter, Sandor finally suggested they speak alone. Nymella agreed without hesitation. They left the gawking courtiers behind in the great hall and walked to a small garden tucked within the Red Keep's walls. It was a chilly spot in winter, the bare branches of rose bushes reaching like skeletal fingers. But a few lanterns lit the paths, casting a soft glow. Sandor stopped by a low stone bench, turning to face her. I'm no good at this, he said bluntly. The pleasantries and all, you should know that. She studied him, a faint smile on her lips. I appreciate your honesty. I didn't come here expecting a man of courtly graces. I know your history, your grace, and I know the realm's rumors. They say you're fierce, ruthless, a king who took the throne by slaying his own brother. He stiffened slightly at the mention of Gregor, but she continued, her gaze unwavering. They also say you've worked tirelessly to feed the small folk, to stabilize the city, and to root out bandits. And that you lead from the front whether against pirates or rebels. That's a kind of nobility too. Naryae. He exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. My brother was a monster. Slaying him was the only way to end what he'd started. I never wanted a crown, and I'm not sure I want a wife either. But the realm needs alliances, and so I'm here, and so are you. Nymella nodded. I understand. Dorne has remained apart for too long, nursing old wounds. My uncle sees an opportunity in you, a different kind of king, not one weighed down by the same grudges and legacies that have plagued Westeros for generations. If you and I were to wed, it wouldn't be a fairy tale. But perhaps it could be a means to forge peace. Nay. Sandor admired her frankness. That's one way to put it. I won't make false promises of love or any of that courtly nonsense. But if we wed, I'll treat you with respect, and you'll have a say in how we rule this damned realm. That's all I can offer. She studied his face, the play of lantern light across his scars. It's more than many queens have had before, she said quietly. Truth be told, I have no illusions either. My life has been shaped by political concerns from birth. I'm used to it. But I'm not without ambition. If we join forces, perhaps we can do more than maintain peace. Perhaps we can achieve something better for the realm. Sandor felt a stir of grudging admiration. He had feared a timid lady who would wilt under the city's harsh realities. But Nimella seemed possessed of a calm determination. "You're not afraid of me," he observed. She shrugged lightly. "I learned long ago that fear is a poor guide. I see a scarred man who's carried a great burden. I see no reason to fear you unless you give me one." A half-smile tugged at Sandor's mouth. It felt foreign on his face. He looked away, clearing his throat. "All right then, let the negotiations proceed. We'll settle the details with your uncle's envoys. If we reach an agreement, then we wed. The realm gains Dorn's support, and you gain a crown, though it's hardly a precious thing." Nimella inclined her head. "Very well, Your Grace." They stood in silence for a moment, the cold wind rustling the dormant rosebushes. Snow flurries drifted by the lanterns, melting as they hit the stones. Despite the chill, Sandor felt a warmth inside him he couldn't quite identify. Not love, no, but a sense that perhaps this alliance wouldn't be the farce he had feared. With Nimella's intelligence and composure, she might actually help him shoulder the burdens of rule. Soon after, they parted ways, each retreating to their respective chambers. Over the next weeks, official negotiations took place in the council halls. Prince Kossian voice proposed a dowry of gold, spices, and improved trade rights for Dornish goods in the Crown lands. In return, the Crown would confirm Dorne's privileges, reduce taxes compared to other regions, a degree of self-governance. 1,000 Dornish spears would be garrisoned near King's Landing, under the King's command but sworn to protect Dorne's interests as well. Sandor had little patience for the minor details, leaving them to the Master of Laws and the Master of Coin, but he made sure no one tried to cheat either side. Nimella occasionally joined the sessions, offering suggestions with a clear-eyed practicality that seemed to impress even the cynical lords. Finally, an agreement was struck. A grand wedding would be held in the Red Keep in early spring, timed so that travelers could attend before the worst storms. Invitations were sent to the major lords of Westeros, summoning them to witness the union of King Sandor Clegane and Lady Nimella of Dorne. The news spread like wildfire, prompting all manner of speculation. Some doubted the match would last, claiming the Hound was too brutal, too unrefined. Others saw a cunning strategy that might hold the realm together against external threats. Through it all, Sandor maintained a stoic front, though inside he wrestled with the enormity of what lay ahead. Winter dragged on, each day a litany of minor crises. The threat of the Golden Company lingered, though no new word reached them from across the sea. The City Watch continued to root out bandits in the countryside. Grain shipments arrived from the Reach, alleviating some hunger among the small folk. Nimella spent her days meeting with courtiers, learning the nuances of King's Landing's politics and occasionally touring the city's wards with a small escort. She displayed an interest in the plight of the poor, speaking with them directly. Sandor heard reports that she even visited the Street of Silk once to speak with the madams about the new taxes on certain businesses. That made him chuckle, a Dornish lady strolling through the city's pleasure district, fearless in her curiosity. As the wedding day approached, the Red Keep bustled with preparations. Florists, tailors, cooks, and musicians arrived in droves, all eager to take part in the ceremony that might define the new era of peace. Sandor allowed them to do their work with minimal input, though he refused to wear overly elaborate garments. Nimella, for her part, approved designs for a wedding gown that combined subtle Dornish influences with the more traditional Southern style. Her ladies-in-waiting gushed about the color of the fabric, a pale gold that complemented her skin. Rumor said she insisted on a simpler headpiece rather than a gaudy crown, stating that she wished to honor the realm's austerity during winter. The day dawned cold but clear, sunlight sparkling on frost-covered battlements. Bells rang out across King's Landing, summoning nobles and small folk alike to witness the union. The Great Septi, still bearing repairs from past conflicts, was adorned with flowers imported from Dorne's hothouses. Incense drifted in the air, mixing strangely with the crisp winter breeze. Lords and ladies packed the pews, decked in furs and silks, while the small folk gathered outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of their king and his Dornish bride. Sandor waited near the altar, flanked by a handful of close advisors. He wore dark attire that was finely tailored but not ostentatious, a black doublet with subtle gold embroidery depicting the 3 hounds of House Clegane, matched by a fur-lined cloak. His scar was freshly shaved around, the hair on his head trimmed. He felt awkward standing there, the subject of so many stares, but he forced himself to remain composed. If he could face the mountain in battle, he could endure this. Nymella entered the sept on her uncle's arm. Prince Kos was a tall, regal figure, his bronze skin hinting at a life in the Dornish sun. Nymella's gown was as rumored, pale gold, with intricate stitching that caught the light. A light veil of sheer fabric framed her face, which was set in that poised expression Sandor had come to recognize. As she passed, some of the lords and ladies inclined their heads. Small folk pressed in at the sept's doors, craning to see. At the altar, Prince Kos placed her hand in Sandor's. Sandor felt a jolt at the warm touch of her fingers. She met his gaze, offering a small nod. The High Septon, a gray-bearded man draped in ceremonial robes, began the rites, reciting prayers to the 7. Sandor had never been devout, but he stood still, ignoring the aches in his knee, the dryness in his throat. He caught glimpses of the crowd, some watchers from the city, knights from the Vale, even a few envoys from the north who had come out of curiosity. Perhaps this wedding would be the realm's turning point, or perhaps it was yet another union that would unravel. But in that moment, under the fragrant haze of incense, it felt like something else, like the forging of a fragile hope. When the Septon bade them exchange vows, Sandor spoke in a low, earnest voice. He promised to protect her, to share burdens, to rule justly. He had rehearsed none of it, letting the words emerge as they would. Nymella responded with her own vows, pledging loyalty, partnership, respect. Then came the binding of their hands with a ribbon of white silk, and the pronouncement before the 7. Applause and cheers rang out in the sept, echoing off the marble columns. The bells outside pealed louder, joined by the roar of the crowd thronging the streets. Sandor faced Nymella, uncertain for a heartbeat. Then he lifted her veil and kissed her gently, mindful of his scars. She returned it without hesitation, her lips warm against his. The watchers cheered anew, and Sandor stepped back, aware that every eye was upon them. In that instant, he felt a pang, of what, he couldn't say. Longing, perhaps, or relief that she did not recoil. That small moment felt more potent than any vow. The wedding feast unfolded in the Red Keep's grand hall. Tables groaned with roasted meats, spiced Dornish wines, winter vegetables and pastries shaped like suns and spears. Musicians played lively tunes, alternating between Dornish rhythms and the more familiar songs of King's Landing. Nymella moved among the guests with poised grace, accepting congratulations and offering smiles. Sandor stayed by her side, though large gatherings made him uneasy. He downed cups of ale and wine, trying to keep his temper in check as various lords approached with flattery. He saw the Master of Coin beaming with relief. This marriage might unlock new trade and revenues. He saw the Master of Laws nodding respectfully. The 1,000 Dornish spears had already marched into the city, under strict orders from Prince Kos to support the crown. To Sandor's surprise, the small folk outside the keep also seemed to celebrate. A portion of the leftover feast was distributed among them, as was customary on royal wedding days. With fresh bread and casks of ale flowing, the mood in the streets turned festive. Children danced with ribbons, street performers juggled torches. Perhaps the city was simply grasping at any excuse to forget winter's hardships for a night. But Sandor took a moment to look out from a balcony and see the lanterns bobbing like fireflies among the crowds. He hoped, fleetingly, that this day's joy might endure a little longer than most in this blood-soaked land. That night, after the revelry waned, Sandor and Nymella withdrew to their chambers. King and Queen. The notion felt surreal to him. He found himself pacing near the window, staring at the moonlit courtyard. Nymella watched him quietly from where she stood near the hearth, her gown exchanged for a simpler robe. There was no forced coyness, no shyness in her demeanor. When he finally turned to face her, words failed him. She stepped closer, reaching out to take his hand. "You're tense," she said gently. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Always have been, and now, well, you know." She smiled, and it lit her eyes. "I do. We'll figure it out, Your Grace, together." That was how they began their marriage, not with wild passion but with quiet understanding. They talked softly about the day's events, the responsibilities yet to come, the uncertain future. When they finally laid down, Sandor was surprised at how comforting her presence felt, though he barely knew her. Something in the warmth of another person reminded him that he was not alone in this. If she was willing to stand beside him, perhaps the burden of the crown would feel a fraction lighter. In the days after the wedding, the city settled back into its routines. The 1,000 Dornish spears set up camp in a portion of the city's outskirts, while Prince Cole and his retainers prepared to return to Dorne. Before leaving, the prince met with Sandor and Amela privately, making final assurances that any threat to King's Landing would be met with Dornish steel. Sandor thanked him curtly, always wary of well-spoken lords, but Nymella exchanged a fond farewell with her uncle, who seemed genuinely affectionate toward his niece. Soon, the Red Keep was emptier, though the presence of Queen Nymella had already begun to leave an imprint. She spent her mornings in the library, conferring with maesters on matters of governance. She visited the City Watch headquarters, speaking with the captain about security concerns. She even ordered some of her personal funds to be used for feeding orphans and widows left over from past wars, a gesture that won her quiet respect among the small folk. Sandor observed all this with a mixture of admiration and relief. He had feared that a courtly queen would demand feasts, jousts, and lavish displays. But Nymella was content to strengthen the realm's foundations, focusing on real needs. When they spoke in the evenings, often over a simple meal in a small dining hall, Sandor found her mind as keen as any counselor's. She did not shy away from discussing everything from tax levies to strategic responses should the Golden Company appear. Their conversations were direct, at times blunt, but they shared a seriousness of purpose that transcended the usual trappings of royal marriage. That sense of unity was soon tested. Word arrived one bitter morning that the pirate incursions had flared up again off the Stormland's coast. A band of sea raiders had attacked 3 merchant ships, capturing one and setting fire to the others. The shipping lanes were threatened once more. The council erupted into anxious debate, with some demanding immediate military action and others cautioning that the fleet was not fully repaired yet. Sandor, growing impatient with the bickering, decided to ride to the ports himself to assess the damage, just as he had done before. Nymella surprised the council by insisting she accompany him. Several lords objected. Surely the queen should remain safe within the Red Keep. But she brushed them off, stating that if she was to be a true partner in governance, she needed first-hand knowledge of the realm's issues. Sandor agreed, albeit with some reluctance, not wanting to expose her to danger. But she insisted, and he found it difficult to argue with her logic. Thus, they set out together with a modest retinue, 2 of Sandor's most trusted knights, a handful of watchmen, and a few Dornish guards who had chosen to remain close to their queen. The journey south was cold and wet, the roads choked with slush. Along the way, they encountered scattered farms and villages struggling under winter's harshness. Nymella took every opportunity to speak with the villagers, asking about their hardships, the presence of outlaws, the price of food. Sandor listened, occasionally stepping in to ensure no trouble brewed. The sight of their king and queen riding together stirred curiosity and, in some, genuine hope. After several days, they reached the port town battered by the pirates. The charred remains of one merchant vessel still floated near the docks, masts snapped off like a broken twig. The townsfolk, weary and frightened, gathered to plead for royal protection. Sandor and Nymella spent hours talking with ship captains, dock workers, and local guards. They learned that the pirates attacked in small, swift galleys, vanishing into coves along the rocky coastline before the local lords could muster a defense. That evening, Sandor held a council in the town's small keep, inviting the local lord, his knights, and representatives of the merchants. Nymella sat beside him, taking notes on a parchment as the men spoke. They debated strategies, stationing war galleys, setting traps in known pirate haunts, negotiating with neighboring lords for additional ships. The local lord, a man named Karen Birch, was nervous about sending his few remaining vessels out to sea in winter storms. Merchant captains worried about losing profit if they had to hire more guards. Tensions ran high. Eventually, Sandor slammed a fist on the table to silence the arguing. "Enough," he growled. "We can't sit idle while these raiders burn your ships and murder your crews. We'll send a message to King's Landing to dispatch what remains of our fleet here. I'll sail with them if need be, to hunt these pirates in their damned coves. Lord Birch paled. Your Grace, you'd risk. I don't sit behind walls when my people are threatened, Sandor snapped, then glanced at Nymella. And the Queen will remain here with a garrison to coordinate defenses on land, in case these pirates try a shore raid. Nymella nodded, though she showed no sign of fear. We'll fortify the harbor and ensure supplies are protected. I'll speak with the locals tomorrow to organize a militia. Winter or not, we need more eyes watching the coast. The men exchanged uncertain looks but could not deny the authority in both their voices. Though some might have scoffed at a queen taking a direct role, Nymella carried herself with the same calm resolve she had shown in King's Landing. That night, as she and Sandor retired to modest chambers in the keep, they spoke quietly of the plan. She expressed concern for his safety at sea, but he merely shrugged. Fighting pirates was not the greatest danger he'd ever faced. She smiled at that, acknowledging that they both took risks for the sake of the realm. Ravens flew back and forth. Within a week, 3 war galleys arrived from King's Landing, partially repaired but seaworthy enough. Sandor boarded the largest with a detachment of seasoned watchmen and knights. Before he departed, he clasped Nymella's hand at the docks, in full view of curious onlookers. She met his gaze, worry flickering in her eyes. He offered a gruff nod, as if to say he'd be back soon. Then he turned and strode up the gangplank, barking orders for the crew to cast off. The galleys rode out to sea under leaden skies, the wind snapping at their sails. Sandor stood at the prow, scanning the horizon. Somewhere along these coasts, pirates lurked in hidden inlets. They would need cunning and patience to flush them out. Over the next days, the royal galleys probed coves, sending out small scouting boats to check for hidden ships. At times, the weather turned foul, driving sleet and stinging winds across the decks. Men shivered in their cloaks, cursing the winter sea. But Sandor pressed them on, determined to show that the crown would not tolerate marauders. Eventually their vigilance paid off. A scout boat returned with word of a small cove where 2 pirate galleys lay at anchor, concealed by rocky outcroppings. Sandor ordered a dawn assault. Under cover of darkness, they rowed silently toward the cove, lanterns doused, guided only by the pale moonlight reflecting off the waves. Closer and closer they crept, the war galleys moving with surprising stealth for their size. As the first light of morning touched the horizon, they closed in. The pirates, caught unawares, scrambled to get under sail. Shouts echoed across the water. Sandor roared for his archers to loose their arrows. A hail of shafts whistled overhead, striking the pirate decks. 1 pirate galley caught fire, the flames fed by scattered lamp oil. The second tried to slip away around a jutting rock, but Sandor directed the helmsman to cut them off. A crash of wood against wood, grappling hooks thrown, and the boarding began. Sandor led the charge, leaping across the gap with his sword flashing. He met 2 pirates head-on, parrying one's crude cutlass and backhanding the other with the pommel of his weapon. The deck became a small-scale battlefield, men slipping on water and blood. Swords clanged, men cried out. Smoke rolled across the waves from the burning pirate ship, where some pirates leapt overboard rather than burn. Sandor fought with the same brutal efficiency that had once earned him the name Hound. A slash to disarm, a thrust to finish. Another pirate lunged at him with a long spear, but Sandor sidestepped, grabbing the shaft and yanking the man off balance. He ended him with a swift, almost casual blow. By sunrise, the pirates were either dead or captured. Sandor's men cheered as the second galley was seized. They had lost a few good fighters in the fray, but the victory was theirs. Sandor stood on the pirate deck, panting, his sword dripping. The smell of smoke, salt and iron filled his nostrils. He nodded at his watchmen to gather the prisoners and put out any remaining flames. Once again, he had thrown himself into the front lines to protect a realm that would likely never thank him enough. But that was the nature of the duty he had accepted. Over the next week, they continued patrolling, dismantling a small pirate network that had plagued the coast. Some raiders escaped, slipping away into the open sea, but the threat to the local ports was largely quelled. When at last Sandor returned to the harbor town, he found that Nymella had established a rudimentary militia and convinced local merchants to fund more permanent watchtowers along the coast. She greeted him at the docks with a calm smile, relief evident in her eyes. As they walked side by side up the quay, townsfolk bowed and murmured thanks. A few ventured cheers. Sandor felt an odd mixture of pride and discomfort. He had never cared for crowds or praise. But seeing the queen and king together, working in tandem to protect their people, seemed to spark a glimmer of faith among the populace. In private, Naimela asked about the casualties, sorrow in her voice for the men lost. Sandor shrugged heavily. War is never without cost, he said. She nodded, acknowledging the hard truth. They stayed a few more days to finalize arrangements for local defenses, then began the journey back to King's Landing. The roads remained treacherous, but the morale of their party was surprisingly high, bolstered by success at sea. Sandor and Naimela rode at the head of the column, often speaking quietly of the realm's future. They spoke of forging roads that connected Dorne more seamlessly to the Crown lands, of encouraging commerce so that fewer men would turn to banditry. They spoke of the Golden Company, and how to fortify the coasts if that threat materialized. And sometimes, they spoke of smaller things, how she missed the warmth of the Dornish sun, how he found solace in the hush of a winter night. Bit by bit, they discovered a common ground, if not in love, then in mutual respect, and a determination to shape a better realm. Yet the shadows of greater dangers loomed. As they neared King's Landing, ravens arrived bearing unsettling news. Scouts along the coast reported unfamiliar ships sighted in the distance, large war galleys flying no banner. A fisherman claimed to have seen elephants unloaded on a distant shore, though that sounded preposterous. Whispers of the Golden Company grew more urgent. Sandor's jaw tightened as he read the dispatches. Elephants were a known hallmark of that formidable sellsword force. If they had truly landed, war was inevitable. He shared the letters with Naimela that night, in a small village inn where they had taken shelter from a storm. She read them by candlelight, her face pale in the flickering glow. "We should hurry back," she said. "The realm must prepare." Sandor agreed. "We'll ride hard at first light. We'll need every sword we can muster, and we'll need alliances, supplies, everything." Naimela laid a hand on his arm. "We'll face it together." He nodded, swallowing past the knot in his throat. Another war. Another wave of bloodshed. And yet in the face of it he felt less alone than he ever had. Perhaps that was the essence of marriage, a shared burden in a world that rarely offered comfort. He closed his eyes briefly, steeling himself for what lay ahead. If the Golden Company had come, there would be no easy victory. But he was the Hound and he was king, and he had a queen at his side who believed in standing her ground. If the Sellswords thought Westeros would fall easily, they were in for a rude awakening. They rode at dawn through lashing rain, the wind pushing them onward. Before them loomed the uncertain horizon, where warships and rumors converged, where the fragile alliances Sandor had built would be tested by fire and steel. The road was long, the land scarred, and the people wary. But for the first time, Sandor felt a glimmer of resolve that went beyond his usual grim determination. He had something to protect, a realm that, if not beloved, was at least worth saving, and a partner who shared his burdens. Whatever darkness awaited them, they would greet it head-on. The Hound had slain the mountain, tamed the capital's chaos, and carved his place on the Iron Throne through grit and defiance. Now, with a queen at his side, he would face down the Golden Company, or any other threat that dared challenge the fragile order he had forged. And if the gods were unkind, if the realm was doomed to another cycle of bloodshed, then Sandor Clegane would fight until his last breath to prove he was more than just a scarred hound. He was a king who had found, in the unlikeliest union, a reason to stand firm against the nightmares still lurking in the shadows of Westeros.